let me just mention the addition of putting the productivity factor in is something that we find in many of the episodes we look at really essential. And this is something, and Juan Carlos mentioned that I had my PhD from Yale University, and I was trained as a Keynesian. And my professor of macro, Jim Toba, I come from Yale, but so in my view, might be prejudice, he's the greatest of American Keynesians. And we read Keynes, and he explicitly did not talk about this. He has a chapter on cathedrals and pyramids in general theory, and he thought it's good to have a little bit of productivity, but that's secondary. And I think I stopped being a Keynesian when I started disagreeing with that. So what we're also going to always do is do graphs that compare what's happening both in the model and in the data to balanced growth. Balanced growth is nice because it's very easy to analyze theoretically, and it's also nice because recent US data looks a lot like balanced growth. What's going to happen in balanced growth? Our measures of the capital input and labor input, and I'm going to have to modify our measure of capital input so that it fits this theory, stay roughly constant in balanced growth. And the growth in output is induced by growth in productivity alone. So here's the equation that we're going to use as our growth accounting equation. And this is not Solow and Denison's balanced growth. This is something that Ed and I came up with. But it's just a slight modification. We take a Cobb-Douglas production function, and what we have on the n's going to be working age population, and L is going to be hours worked, Y output, K capital, and A is going to be the traditional measure of TFP. And I'm going to modify things a bit, because what I want to have on the right-hand side is not some measure of capital per worker or capital per person. Instead, I'm going to have capital output. And you're going to see why that's good, because in a balanced growth path, capital output ratio is going to be constant. Capital is going to have to grow to keep up with technology, and that's why we have that exponent alpha over 1 minus alpha instead of just alpha. But the nice thing about this is just how nice and clean the picture is going to look. So here it is. This is maybe like when you go to the John Meadow Museum, and you're asking somebody, what exactly is that? And then they say, well, you know, just step back and look a little bit more carefully. You'll see what's going on. I want you to see a balanced growth path. And of course, this is not quite a balanced growth path, and the deviations from balanced growth lead to, every deviation has a literature associated with it. But I want you to think that hours worked and the capital output ratio are roughly constant. And look at them compared to the thin black line, which is just a line constant at 100, the index in 1970. And you see the deviations are small. What does small mean? Between 1984 and about 2000, 2001, there's a big increase in labor input. People have written lots of papers on that. But roughly constant. Then output's risen pretty steadily, and it's pretty much associated with increases in productivity. Now, between in this period in the early 1970s, productivity growth looked about flat, and they call that the Great Productivity Slowdown. But even so, you squint your eyes a bit, and you see two flat lines and two lines that move steadily up together. So that's what the United States looks like. This is what Spain looks like. So it's different. Actually, if we went back to 1960, between 1960 and 1975, it seems Spain was on something that looked like a balanced growth path. And in 1975, something happened. And I know what happened, okay? And Juan Carlos and I have written a paper about that. But what we know is that things really seem to change in 1975. And in particular, movements in output are driven by movements in labor. So this is a different sort of phenomenon. What's very unfortunate, and you all know about, because you read about this in the paper. I was reading the Vanguardia just last week, and they were talking about research and development and innovation. And, you know, something happened. Productivity just stopped in the late 1990s in Spain. That's unfortunate. But, you know, output kept growing because, for various reasons, temporary contracts and part-time work, various things happened that meant people worked more and more. At least up until the recent crisis. So that's just a different kind of picture. The particular mechanism that Juan Carlos and I put in that gives us a lot of the movement, at least between 1975 and 1995, is increases in consumption taxes and labor taxes, particularly Social Security taxes in Spain. But what was happening after that is a different kind of phenomenon. And what's happened over the last 2 years is going to be something we have to study. I mean, you really notice the sharp turn down, and it's not associated with the drop in productivity. Productivity is still flat. It's not moving up at any trend rate, but what's happening bad in Spain now is due to drops in labor. Same as the United States, by the way. And I'm going to come back to this point later, because I'm going to suggest is something we need to do for research is compare what's happening here to what happened back here. Two recessions of similar magnitude. The recession in the early 1980s seems to be associated with, at least from the growth accounting perspective, drop in productivity. The recent one, not. Productivity has still been moving up. Not very fast, but it's moved up. Okay, so here's how I'd apply my methodology to the Great Depression in the United States. I am not the person who did this. I mean, I happen to have done these particular calculations, but this is what Hal Cole and Leo Hanian do. I would have to become a lot more convinced about all the conclusions they draw from the analysis before I'd want to enter a deep discussion of this. You see, my grandfather was not just a labor union member, but a labor union organizer in the 1990s, and he told me that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a saint, was a modern-day saint. And Hal Cole and Leo Hanian don't think that, and so I would have to do a lot of rearranging of my thoughts to have this worked out. But let's just go through the exercise. So